Today's speech is about geopolitics. It's about a region on our planet that has seen centuries of change. It's a region for many people where modern history begins. In 1970, at this very podium, Captain James Lovell, and he's the guy that famously, he was on Apollo 13, and he's the guy that famously said, "Houston, we have a problem." He was at this podium, and he said a very profound statement about life on our planet. He said, "As viewed from space, global unity is the most striking characteristics of planet Earth. We see its cloud systems encircling our world, their beauty startling against the great void in which it exists, that no artificial barriers of national boundaries can be seen. The land areas are bounded only by seas and oceans, and together, with the atmosphere and the sun, they interact as an ecological unit. If we are to maintain the Earth as a livable dwelling place for mankind, we must learn to view it as a whole. We must understand that our existence depends on the delicate balance of nature, and that this balance includes not only all of mankind, but of all living things." The Middle East is a vague geographic area that describes a region in Western Asia, somewhere east of Eastern Europe, west of East Asia, northeast of Central Africa, and south of Central Asia. Determining where the Middle East is a challenge in of itself. The jewel of the Middle East is Israel, a relatively new nation with thousands of years of history. Modern Israel is the home of innovation, culture, and promise. It is a thriving and stable democracy situated in a troubled region. Israelis are highly educated, tolerant, and keenly aware of the world around them. Israel is a rich country with archaeological treasures, unparalleled natural beauty, and a thriving economy. Mr. Schneeweiss was born in Sydney, Australia. I met him earlier today, and I said, "Man, I've never really met an Israeli guy before. You sound like you're Australian." He has a master's degree from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and joined the Israeli Foreign Ministry thereafter. He served as a policy advisor to 2 foreign ministers, including Ehud Barak, and was a press secretary to the Israeli mission in London, England. Until his recent appointment to Canada, he served as the deputy ambassador to China. Here to address the Empire Club of Canada on the challenges that Israel is facing around the world, and in particular in the Middle East, please welcome the Consul General of Israel, Mr. DJ Schneeweiss.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the audience for being here and for that very warm ovation. It's a pity my parents couldn't be here to hear that, because my father would have enjoyed it. My mother would have actually believed that you were celebrating something. As far as we've been able to ascertain, this is the first occasion that an Israeli diplomat has spoken at the Empire Club since Ambassador Mordechai Shalev in 1976. I don't know if his speech was so bad that you never wanted another Israeli back, or it was so good you didn't want us to come in here and outshine all of your other speakers. But all I can say is it's been too long. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. I also want to thank Eddie Sonshine of RioCan and Bruce Lieboff of Gluskin Chef for their sponsorship making today's event possible. Their support of Israel, their dedication to the partnership between our 2 countries, and their personal friendship are all a source of great encouragement and strength. Ladies and gentlemen, Israel today is a paradox. A country faced by unprecedented threats and challenges, yet safer and more full of promise than at any time in its history. On the one hand, the Middle East has entered a period of turmoil and chronic instability, which is challenging the fundamental underpinnings of our strategic environment. Add to this the unreconstructed nuclear ambitions of Iran and the threat Tehran's missiles and those of her proxies pose to our home front, and the view from Jerusalem looks stark indeed. Yet, at the same time, our tiny state is displaying strengths and capacities that continue to propel it to the forefront of global achievement and to offer us the opportunity of greater international integration, acceptance, and relevance than we have ever known. Canada's connection and involvement in that story, particularly looking forward, will be the endpoint of my talk today. But first, let's look at the challenges facing Israel, Jerusalem's inbox, if you like. The Middle East is in a state of turmoil and tumult, the likes of which have not been seen in generations. In its first blush, the Arab awakening represented a clear shift in the power balance between the rulers and the ruled. Where fear had prevailed for decades, suddenly it was gone. The masses were on the streets, and the leaders were on the defensive. This shift in the internal balance of power within the Arab world seemed to promise a new dawn and a quick, popular march towards democracy. With Syria leading the charge, however, what we are seeing now is a reversal of that trend, a reassertion of power by the traditional leadership, which leaves the story very much in flux. At a more fundamental structural level, what we are seeing in the Arab world are clear trends which point to a crumbling of the nation-state model, superimposed on the region by the Western powers a century ago. Today, the much longer-standing ethnic and religious cleavages which historically defined the region are once again coming to the fore, placing existing state structures under profound challenge. As a result, we see little to suggest that democracy, or even anything remotely approaching it, is likely to flourish in the Middle East anytime soon. The popular desire for change and freedom notwithstanding, there is very limited ability or desire amongst key political actors to accommodate it, to assure fair and repeated elections, and to allow the full gamut of values and institutions that are necessary for democracy actually to take root. Without these things, the hopes and dreams embodied in the very concept of the Arab Spring, so-called, will continue to be not just elusive, but impossible to realize. And in their stead will come a volatile and unpredictable power struggle that may last generations. Israel is most definitely and demonstrably not the eye of this Arab storm. The events of recent years within the Arab world have proven that we are not the story. But we do lie very much in the path of destruction that the storm may wreak. Added to this volatile mix, we also face the nuclear and attendant hegemonic ambitions of the repressive, terror-sponsoring regime in Iran. Tehran's relentless drive towards nuclear weapons brought the international community to adopt 6 Security Council resolutions condemning Iran's actions and imposing biting sanctions. It is the combination of these sanctions and a credible military threat that recently brought Iran to the negotiating table, and we in Israel take pride in the responsible role that we have played alongside the US and other like-minded countries, including Canada, throughout this long and arduous process. Having come so far, having brought Tehran to begin to seek a way out of the stranglehold of the sanctions, Israel believes that the interim deal reached in Geneva is a mistake. Through its de facto recognition of an Iranian right to enrich uranium, the core of the Iranian military nuclear program, and a right, I may add, that no other nation on earth has ever demanded or received. Through allowing Iran to keep its centrifuges intact and maintain other components of its military program, such as warheads and ballistic capabilities, and through affording sanctions relief that reverses the very psychological and economic momentum that brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place, and that needs to be in place in order to keep Tehran there, We believe the Geneva deal weakens the position of the P5+1 in future negotiations towards a comprehensive deal. Iran continues to pose a grave threat to regional and global security and peace. Another realm of challenge we face, one that too often goes unnoticed, unreported, and unaddressed, is the ongoing vilification of Israel and the Jewish people in the Arab and Muslim world. Consistent reports by the ADL in the United States and others have logged thousands of anti-Semitic and anti-Israel cartoons and articles in the Arab media. Meanwhile, online and in some universities, hate speech and vilification of Israel and the Jewish people repeatedly goes unchecked. Put simply, minds are being poisoned, particularly Arab and Muslim minds, intentionally, consistently, in ways which severely undercut our ability to forge normal, peaceful relations with our neighbors and others around the world. I come now to the Palestinian issue. Israel has sought to live in peace and coexistence with our Palestinian neighbors from the outset. In 1947, when the UN voted to partition the British Mandate into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, we said yes. The Arab states said no and launched a war to destroy us. In the many decades since, particularly in the 20 years since Oslo, we have made repeated offers of territorial compromise, we have withdrawn from territories, we have removed ourselves from governing the daily lives of Palestinians, recognized the need for a Palestinian state, and more. But we continue to come up empty-handed. Many ordinary Palestinians no doubt yearn, as we do, for the simple blessings of peace. And no doubt many of Israel's actions have impacted negatively and left Palestinians feeling victimized or worse. But it is a simple, undeniable fact that this conflict began long before a single Israeli community was established in the West Bank. This conflict began with the Arab world's refusal to accept our very right to exist. In the words of a notable Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the people of Israel have the right to know that their national existence is not at stake. That seems to me to be fundamental. Efforts to bring peace and all its benefits, this Nobel Prize laureate continues, to bring peace and all its benefits to the Middle East will be of no avail unless Israel and the people of Israel are released from the overhanging fear which naturally envelops the country as a result of the threats of destruction and the political and economic warfare directed against it. That quote is not from Menachem Begin or Anwar Sadat or President Carter in 1979, and it's not from Prime Minister Rabin or Foreign Minister Perez in 1994, and nor is it a quote from Barack Obama in 2008, 2009. These were the words of a certain Lester B. Pearson, at the time Foreign Minister of Canada, in the House of Commons in Ottawa on January 24th, 1956. 1956. Today, there is simply too much evidence that the same core of the conflict, which Pearson spoke of then, continues to dominate the Palestinian consciousness and political program. The glorification of terrorists, the consistent denial of any Jewish history in or connection to the Holy Land, the unwavering demand for a so-called right to flood Israel even after a Palestinian state is established with the descendants of the Palestinian refugees created by the very wars of aggression against us. All these continue to serve as profound obstacles to the peace we seek. Ladies and gentlemen, put all this together and you have a neighborhood that is neither stable, nor predictable, nor easily manageable, nor, from an Israeli perspective, particularly peaceable. Danger lurks. Our inbox is full. So what are the policy take-homes? What is Israel doing in response to these challenges? As regards the turmoil in the Arab world, caution is the name of the game. In a region that is likely to remain in flux for years, if not decades, Israel will be even more cautious than ever in assessing the threats around it. While always remaining ready to seize new diplomatic opportunities, outsiders' promises and wishful thinking will not be allowed to substitute for realistic assessments and our own efforts to deter any misguided adventurousness on the part of our neighbors. Regarding Iran, Israel will continue to work with the United States and other like-minded countries to ensure that the diplomatic effort to end Iran's military nuclear program achieves the necessary goal. John Kerry is in Israel today as we speak on this issue and others. The precedent of North Korea and the time the international community took to act against severe human rights violations and aggression in places like Rwanda and Yugoslavia teach us that freezing the situation is not enough. We need to roll back and dismantle Iran's enrichment capacity and its dual uranium and plutonium tracks. Our common interest is not just ensuring Iran doesn't have military nuclear weapons now. It is to prevent Iran from having the capacity ever to build such weapons. We believe in and support a negotiated settlement, but one that ends the threat, not one that perpetuates it. On the issue of anti-Semitism, online hate, incitement, and so on, Israel will continue to be vigilant and to lobby for greater vigilance on the part of others. The 20th century teaches us nothing, if not the need to respect the power of bad ideas and the need to confront them. I am pleased to acknowledge here the leadership of Canada on these issues. Canada has understood, perhaps better than any other international actor, how the scourge of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism undermines fundamental Western values and core interests. Ottawa's principled stand on these issues is the truest expression, not only of Canada's current interests, but also of this country's long-standing and principled foreign policy heritage. As regards the Palestinian issue, the policy take-home is simple. Israel will continue to negotiate with the Palestinian leadership in order to reach a fair agreement, one which allows them to realize their legitimate national aspirations while also safeguarding ours. We are ready for Palestinian statehood and for territorial compromise, which will resolve the issue of the settlements. But we also insist that the Palestinians recognize our own inalienable national rights and abandon any further claims on our country. We insist that they educate their people, that their imagined right of return does not exist in theory and will not take place in practice. And also to agree to security arrangements that will safeguard the political accord that we seek. Settlements are not the only issue. Security and Palestinian reconciliation with who we are and what our rights are equally crucial. And speaking these truths to the world and to the Palestinians is not to undermine peace, it is to advance it. There's an old Jewish story told of the wife who complains to her husband late one night, "Howie," she says, "shut the window, it's cold outside." To which Howie responds, "No, and if I close it, will it get any warmer?" Okay. There's something very fundamental to the Israeli experience in this little nugget. It's always cold outside, so to speak. And so too in this era. And as the joke suggests, we can't easily change that. But our story isn't only about what's on the outside. When you lift up the hood and take a look inside Israel at what makes us tick, what you see is a people of spirit, of determination and inventiveness, passion and commitment, with a national ethos of never giving up and always seeking new and better ways to get the job done. A people with a creativity, vitality, and energy that any enterprise would want to patent and cultivate. By dint of these human qualities and the strengths we've built in partnership with our many friends, for all the dangers that lurk, Israel today is better off than it has ever been. In security terms, we have not faced a regular army in battle since 1973, having convinced our adversaries that defeating us through traditional warfare is impossible. Our peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan remain strong for all the instability and challenge they have come under. We have largely overcome the challenge of Palestinian terrorism for the moment through a mix of deterrent and defensive measures and diplomatic initiatives. And we have successfully developed a cutting-edge, three-tiered missile defense system which offers an effective response to the missile threat posed by Hezbollah and others. Meanwhile, in economic and diplomatic terms, Israel is more integrated than ever in the global economy and the international system, more able not only to look after its citizens and realize their dreams of a better, more prosperous future, but also more able to make a tangible and recognized contribution to global well-being. To give you just a few recent examples, Israel joined the OECD in 2010, joining the ranks of the world's leading economies. Israel is the only non-European member of the EU's flagship Horizon 2020 R&D framework, having been welcomed into the program in 1996 and invited back every time since, out of nothing other than pure European self-interest. Just this week, Israel rejoined the UN Human Rights Council, having successfully been admitted into the West European and Others group, and negotiated a significant reduction in that body's, and I quote, biased and discriminatory approach towards us. And those, by the way, are not my words, they're the words of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. On another UN front, the General Assembly this past Tuesday passed an Israeli-initiated resolution adopted by a majority of 138 countries promoting agricultural technology for development. Israel's record in terms of disaster assistance and international development aid is also noteworthy. Our emergency medical teams are consistently amongst the first on the ground in disaster situations anywhere in the world. Mashav, our national aid agency, has trained over 270,000 people and provided international assistance to over 140 countries. Meanwhile, Israel's technological prowess has become legendary. We are ranked top in the world by the World Economic Forum for the quality of our scientific research institutions and fourth overall for our innovative capacity. Our innovation ecosystem is admired and studied around the world, and Israeli-developed technologies, as everybody knows, are continuing to transform computing, medicine, telecoms, agriculture, energy, water, cybersecurity, and myriad other industries as well. Today, more than 250 multinational companies maintain research and development centers in Israel, 80 of which of these companies are Fortune 500 members. I could go on and on. These diverse achievements have not come easy, nor is it ever smooth sailing. But that's the point. Despite the difficulties, despite the noisy clamoring of those who wish us ill, or those who only see Israel in caricature as a one-dimensional creation that has no life outside of its role as the villain in the never-ending Palestinian saga, the reality is that we are recognized by elites and decision-makers around the world to be more interesting and more relevant to their own success than ever before. Which brings me then to the heart of my remarks here today, the Canada-Israel relationship and how we can carry it forward. As you know, Israel's 8 million souls live in a territory that would fit pretty comfortably in the slither of territory of Canada between Toronto and Ottawa. I served in China for 3 years, and my ambassador used to sort of lean over to his Chinese interlocutors, ministers and so on, and whisper to them, you know that together, China and Israel together make up 1/3 of the world's population. So we could do the same about, the world's geography. Canada and Israel together, we're huge. But if you stop to think just for a moment, you realize that for all the difference in size, Canada and Israel have a lot more in common and a far greater affinity than is often realized or spoken of. The friendship which ties our two nations together is founded on the bedrock of shared democratic values and institutions. Both countries are a magnet to immigrants and have benefited greatly from the infusion of new populations and energies. We are both very globally minded, keenly aware that our national well-being requires markets and opportunities and friendly structures way beyond our own borders. With our recent oil and gas discoveries, Israel is now an energy producer like Canada, another line of commonality. We also share different but parallel challenges in resolving with our neighbors exactly how to get that energy to market. Indeed, from its very inception, Israel was understood in Canada to be a like-minded state, one which shares Canada's values and interests, and one in whose existence, security, and vitality Canada itself has an abiding interest. A piece of history not often remembered, Canada was one of the key midwives in securing Israel's birth, having played a pivotal role in securing passage at the UN for the 1947 partition plan. Through the 6.5 decades since, at times of war and during times of stalemate and of real peacemaking, Canada's governments and people of every political stripe, except the most radical fringes, have stood by Israel, recognized its fundamental right to peace and security, and worked responsibly within the UN and beyond to help Israel achieve its worthy objectives. And we appreciate that deeply. Central to this dynamic has been Canada's phenomenal Jewish community, which serves as a bridge between the two societies and a central driver of our respective successes. Captain Danziger mentioned earlier the festival of Hanukkah, and Bemet Chag Sameach to everybody here, a festival of light. But this week in our weekly Torah portion, we will read the story of how Joseph reconciles with his brother, the story of Benjamin, the goblet, reconciliation between brothers. The Jewish community of Canada, many of its leaders who are here today, and I thank them for their presence, is a light, a beacon of tolerance and of communal responsibility, a light and a beacon which makes this society great and helps us make our society great too. The bilateral friendship that has developed through these years continues to manifest itself in burgeoning economic, scientific, medical, cultural, political, defense, juridical, agricultural, and trade ties between the two countries. At the national level, the Harper government has taken our ties to an unprecedented level of closeness and exchange. We are committed and keen to work with the government to take those ties even higher. Prime Minister Harper has announced that he will be traveling to the region in January, and both sides are now working intensively to ensure that his visit brings concrete outcomes that will carry the bilateral relationship to new heights. At the provincial and local levels, too, we are seeing real interest in forging closer ties. This year alone, we expect to host in Israel at least 2 premiers and various mayors, each bringing business delegations with them, just as Ontario Minister of Economy Eric Hoskins did just recently. We're also seeing great interest in Israel from the leadership of Canada's top universities. A formal deal to enhance cooperation was signed last July. There are real synergies and opportunities here, and real benefits that can and will accrue across many fields: energy, security, media, education, innovation, global governance, and more. There's also an affinity of values, of experience. At a recent dinner here in Toronto, former Prime Minister Paul Martin spoke glowingly about the similarities he sees between our societies in how we are addressing the issue of inclusiveness. All that said, the Canada-Israel relationship is not where it should be. Bilateral trade was less than $1.5 billion in 2012, far from its potential. The number of Canadian tourists to Israel hit an all-time high of 75,000 last year, but is still nowhere near its potential. The number of Canadian students using opportunities to study in Israel's world-renowned universities is tiny. Firms are not even fully utilizing the funds government has made available for R&D collaboration. On November the 25th, just a couple of weeks ago, the Israeli company PrimeSense was purchased by Apple for the princely sum of $350 million. This makes it the 13th Israeli high-tech company to be acquired by foreign investors in 2013. Why isn't Canada getting a greater piece of this seriously nutritious pie? Fully 2/3 of the 250 foreign companies I mentioned earlier who maintain R&D centers in Israel are American companies. Where is Canada in this mix? Where are the investments, the acquisitions, the strategic push to plug into one of the world's most dynamic and creative economies? Not where it should be. So what do we need to do? In terms of business, investment and trade, at the government level we need to update and expand the free trade agreement, something both governments have committed to do, and Minister Ed Fast is due in Israel even before the Prime Minister to pursue this. More trade delegations and a greater presence on the ground in Israel will also help Canadian industry identify and act upon opportunities much more readily than it can today. The interest of the city of Vaughan in establishing a representative office in Israel is showing the way here. Canadian companies looking to gain market advantage through technology and innovation should utilize the various government-backed R&D funds that we have set up. And they should also take a much closer look at the NASDAQ and other exchanges where established Israeli companies and new IPOs are consistently creating value for shareholders. We need perhaps to look into ways of leveraging the intense and robust US-Israel science and technology relationship. The close ties we both enjoy with the US should make this possible. There is no doubt also that great mutual advantage is to be gained from Canadian investment and involvement in Israel's nascent energy industry. Our need for Canadian expertise, experience, and capacities offers concrete opportunities that have yet to be realized. There's value to be found also in exploring synergies that build upon Canada's ethnic diversity to bring Canada into the burgeoning technology partnerships that Israel is building with third countries, such as India, something we are working on together with local community partners here in Toronto. Similarly, in terms of global development and international affairs, Canada and Israel can do much more to extract and leverage the latent value of our shared agendas and respective strengths. Closer coordination between CEDA, Canada's international aid agency, and Mashav will see us both enhance our impact in developing countries. We can and should further upgrade academic and student exchanges and collaboration in the sciences and higher education. Closer diplomatic coordination will also bring benefits in important areas such as counterterrorism. At the bottom line, there are no losers here, only winners. The more we invest in richer exchanges and interaction between us, the more we will all gain. Mr. President, from its inception, Israel has sought to anchor itself in the international system, in both the hardware of institutions as well as the more fluid software of values, ideas, and solutions. This strategy serves both as a bulwark against the many dangers and threats we face, and as a platform for making our own constructive contribution to the international community. Israel is, and always has been, a much greater story than the chronicle of our relations with our neighbors. And today, Israel continues to refuse to be limited by what those around us do or think. Our Zionist ethos won't let us be passive, but rather impels us always to act upon history, to work to realize our highest aspirations, our highest Jewish and democratic aspirations and ideals. And it is precisely these qualities, this drive, which makes us so relevant to Canada. As like-minded, peace-loving democratic nations, wedded to the values and institutions which guarantee and safeguard our freedoms, Israel and Canada share many profound security, political, and diplomatic interests. And as nations whose economic success is directly linked to maintaining our respective competitive edges, it is bordering on negligent if we don't work harder to harness the synergies and opportunities that reside in the strengths that we both bring to the table. Canada's Prime Minister observed just this past Sunday that Israel and Canada share the same values and face the same threats. He is absolutely right. I believe we can all agree that our two societies also share many, many unrealized opportunities to enrich and strengthen each other, and in doing so, to help fashion a better world for us all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Consul General has agreed to take a number of questions that you may have of him, of his country, or of Australia, or anywhere like that. You may be interested in his answer, but there's a sweetener here. It's being televised, so you may be interested in hearing yourself on television later. So please, there's a couple of microphones running around. Please indicate your interest in asking a question to Mr. Schneeweiss.
All done.
I know we planted a few here earlier, no? Well, question over here.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. What would you think the next first steps might be to move from the reality of today to, there's so many opportunities. Are there some that are just ready to go, and what might they be?
In terms of Israel and Canada, I'd say from an Israeli perspective, we need to see Canada more as a place of opportunity rather than just the backyard of the United States. When Israelis look over the ocean, they tend to see the United States. They don't tend to see much else. And I think when Canada looks beyond its own borders, it also doesn't immediately see Israel. So we have to sort of work to identify together the opportunities that exist. That's part of the purpose of today's presentation. They exist, and we at the consulate continually try and find ways that we can work with our friends, not only to sort of address issues that are within our own space, if you like, but also to sort of face out and to reach out to the rich tapestry that is modern Canada. And I believe the more we do that, the more we reach out into this society, then the more opportunities we can identify. And that's certainly what we try and do and what we encourage our friends to do as well.
Question over there. If you don't mind identifying yourself.
Yeah, oh, that's really loud. My name's Robert Onley. I'm a lawyer here in Toronto. I just had a question with respect to the Geneva deal in terms of Iran's nuclear program. It seems that the terms of the deal have given somewhat tacit recognition of Iran's supposed right to enrich. Over the next 6 months, how could countries and people who disagree with this deal effectively lobby against what seems to have already been acknowledged? And how does Israel perceive its foreign policy in this sort of next 6 months window, which seems to be the final window for diplomacy?
Thank you. I'm always wary of defining things as sort of the last chance, because international affairs have a tendency to go on. They don't ever end, thankfully. So, you know, we don't know yet where we'll be. My guess is 6 months will not be 6 months. That's the first assessment. Everything we've seen so far coming out of the deal is that it hasn't actually, the time frame hasn't actually even kicked off. But the process of getting to where we've gotten to so far with the international sanctions, the UN resolutions and so on, has been a very long one, with a lot of negotiation and coordination and intelligence sharing and arm twisting. It's been an extremely complex and intricate process to make sure to harness the backing of the P5 countries and to get a united position in the room vis-a-vis Tehran. Israel has played a role in that, as Canada has, and that's the kind of role that I believe we will continue to play. We are, obviously keenly engaged. These are genuinely existential issues for us, and that's why the Prime Minister has been so out there in expressing Israel's point of view. This is not the kind of thing that we can sort of put our head on the pillow at night and say, oh, well, it's okay, someone else is looking after it. It just doesn't work like that for us. So we will continue to be vocal when necessary, but we will also continue to be very constructive and helpful in the coordination dimensions that are part of the process. Rolling back what seems to be an acknowledgement of an Iranian right to enrich, and as I said before, there has never been a country in the world that's demanded or received that, will be challenging, but it is our view that that has to be done in order for any kind of deal to be a genuine permanent deal that stops the Iranian military program and makes sure that it never comes back.
Thank you. We have another question, I believe, over here.
Yes, Leo Margulies, another lawyer, unfortunately. One of the things that you identified as an obstacle to peace and an obstacle to Israel, and it's obviously one of the major things in the world today, is the propaganda that goes through the internet, the television, and the propaganda and the hate that continues within their neighbors. And until that changes, first of all, how do you see that changing? Because until that changes, my sense is you'll never get peace because you keep instilling the same wrong values from generation to generation. And so how do you see us or the world getting over that obstacle?
I think, firstly, it has to be, people need to be made aware of it and need to be made aware of how much of an obstacle it is, because it's very easy to just, again, put your head on the pillow at night and not care and not know. But from where we sit, these are crucial issues, and as you've said, without there being a shift in just the general disposition towards our very existence, then the details of any sort of peace that we're talking about are unrooted, they're ungrounded, they're not anchored in the reality of the region, and then they can't thrive. And we're very careful about setting ourselves adrift in that sense. So it requires a global effort. It requires real diplomacy, real statesmanship on the part of leaders, not just to listen and empathize. We need empathy. We all need empathy. Palestinians need empathy. We need empathy. But empathy for us given party or for their suffering or for their interests shouldn't replace the clear-headed analysis and thinking of what are the concrete, building blocks, the foundations that you need in order to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve. So yeah, it is a big issue, and it's one that doesn't receive enough attention.
At the back of the room.
Hi, I'm Mimi Gottfried, and thankfully I'm not a lawyer. I want to ask you something about education. Has the Israeli government or consulate here in Toronto looked at addressing some of the conflicts that are creeping up within our universities?
You mean,
like our universities are becoming a hotbed of politics, and I know some of my children are in different universities, and they call me and tell me some of the issues that they're facing. And
yeah, I'll happily address that. The universities have always been a hotbed of politics. I think that's part of why they were built in the first place, to sort of allow young people to sort of let off steam and conviction and all sorts of very, very firm beliefs that in the fuller light of day and maturity tend to sort of dissipate somewhat in most cases. I'm guessing a lot of people here in the room, I don't want to be too rude, but I'm guessing some people here in the room at least were a little bit radical when they were at university. Maybe, slightly, I don't know. Beryl, I know you were. So, there's always a degree of extremism and noise that I think happens on campus. Israel is an issue in dispute, there's no doubt. There are different agendas, and there are people who have been misled from birth and who are misinformed and ill-informed, and some of them are also ill-intentioned. And they're busy trying to agitate and put out their message. The way to deal with it is a two-pronged response, in my view. Firstly, or at least on the one hand, we have to address any egregious, any insightful, not insight with an S, insightful with a C, incitement. We have to address those kinds of challenges, and anyone who is agitating and making an environment for students that is hostile and uncomfortable and so on, that has to be addressed in the campus, within the campus frame. But the last thing we want to do is to limit ourselves in the frame that our enemies set up for us. Anybody on any issue. The last thing you want to do in advertising or in business is to allow your competitor to define who you are. And what we in Israel try and do, and what we certainly look to those who care about us or want to see us thrive, would hope is that we make sure that while we're battling those battles, we don't allow ourselves to be defined or limited by them. And that we continue to build the kinds of self-affirming and mutually valuable relationships institutionally with universities, through the academic streams, through the exchange of students, and through every other possible collaboration in the university environment that not only brings mutual value, but also serves as the best response to those that are sort of calling for the things that they're calling for. The best response to the negativity is to show people that there's value in connecting to each other. And to be honest, our strategy is working. When we look at that hostile activity against Israel on campus, it's always been there. But look at where Israel is today compared to where it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Look at where our relations with the world are. Look at where our economy is, and look at where we're headed and how plugged in and anchored we are in the institutions and the ideas that really impact on the world. So there are problems and there are sources for concern, but there are good ways to deal with them.
Mr. Consul General, I believe we have time for one last question from the back of the room.
My name is Dr. David Senesh. I'm a visiting scholar in New York. And first, thanks for a very professional lecture. I wanted to ask you if you feel that Israel, after 60 years of occupation, could have done a little bit more proactively work in order to solve this, because it does really hurt the fabric of life in Israel according to Jewish values. So do you think that in line, that we are now in Canada, that we could really be a little bit more creative in solving this problem?
I think when you use the word occupation, I assume you mean the presence of Israel in the West Bank? Is that what you mean? Because you mentioned 60 years, I wasn't sure, because 60 years takes us back to 1953.
I would not go all the way to 84, but I would say from 67.
Okay, thank you. There is no doubt that the Israeli presence in the West Bank is something that bears costs. It takes a cost on us. It takes a cost on the Palestinian people. We're there for all sorts of reasons, political and military. We didn't start the wars that ended up with us there. As I said before, we didn't start this conflict, and we can't end it on our own. But we also have a biblical connection to that place. We just talked about Joseph and brotherly reconciliation in this week's Torah portion. The story of Joseph and of Jacob and so on. Where did they come from when they went down to Egypt to seek food and shelter from the famine? They came from the hilltops of Samaria. Hebron, the heart of the Palestinian territories, is where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are buried. So there is a Jewish connection, there is a national connection of ours to those very territories. We have said that we are willing to compromise. We have said that we're willing to forego our claim to that land. But we can't do it unless we get what we need in return for safeguarding and ensuring the future of our country. So we're there for various reasons. Now, could we have been more creative? That's a political discussion. I'm guessing in any government at any given time, under any circumstance, could probably be more creative. And that's nothing unique to Israel. Any government. But governments, face challenges and face, constraints in addressing the issues that they face. And I know, having served on the staff of some Israeli leaders, the choices are never easy. The choices are never the simple ones that they look like from the outside of, why don't they just get on with it and do that? It's never that simple. The dilemmas are usually between a bad choice and an even worse one. And that's pretty much the reality we're in. I think if there were a credible message of peace and acceptance, of genuine reconciliation, filtering down, not only from the leaders who need to say those things, but filtering down into Palestinian society, you would find Israeli society and its democratically elected government ready to make the compromises necessary for peace. We're ready now, but we're very skeptical at the moment because those very foundations that we spoke of earlier are not really in place. So, yeah, I agree. I think we should all be more creative. We would like to get to that place where we can put our head on the pillow and say we've achieved peace. But there's a famous Arab phrase which says, "One hand alone cannot clap." We can't do it on our own. We need that same sense of reconciliation and willingness to be creative and to tell real truths to ourselves and to our own people. We need that from the other side as well.
Please use both of your hands to clap. And I'd like to call upon Ms. Verity Sylvester to give the appreciation. You can be seated.
I'm never sure whether to bring the glasses, leave them, take them. Anyways, Mr. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to express our thanks to Consul General Schneeweiss. We thank you for your informed perspective of the position of Israel today and the peace process. You have taken some remarkable steps to ensure that Israel is not defined by the sum of their battles, but rather, as you have stated, the core of our nation's humanity and aspirations and the creativity of Israel's society. It has been a privilege to have you as our guest, and thank you for speaking at the Empire Club of Canada.
And as a token of our appreciation, Mr. Consul General, we'd like to present you with this book. It's called Who Said That? Memorable Notes, Quotes, and Anecdotes from 100 Years of Empire Club Speeches. At your tables, you'll see we have a number of upcoming events. We have our annual Christmas luncheon featuring the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, whose son asked a question today. Welcome. That's on December 12th at the Royal York Hotel here. I'd like to thank RioCan Real Estate Investment Trust for sponsoring our event this afternoon, and Gluckson Chef and Associates for sponsoring our VIP reception. I'd I'd like to thank the National Post as our print media sponsor, to Van Valkenburg for providing our AV. This meeting will be carried and aired on Rogers TV, and we are grateful for your ongoing support as well. We're on Twitter and on Facebook, and we have our own website address, which is empireclub.org, where you can get more information on membership to our club. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to hearing from you soon and seeing you at our next lunch. This meeting of the Empire Club of Canada is now adjourned.